Okay, so I'm super excited tonight. Not only do we have an expert in her own right, but it's also just one of my friends. So Christina Carnes Ananais is with us. And she is not only a fellow Arkansan. Were you born in Arkansas, or did you just, fellow Arkansan?
Born and bred.
But also Christina and I were at Duke together. Got to know one another there. We were also in the same church small group for a season. Christina and her husband Joe are very near and dear to our hearts, and are amongst the choir of people that we miss dearly from Durham, North Carolina, who are still holding down the fort somehow over in Durham. Christina is a doctoral student in Christianity and the visual arts. It's a program at Duke that's really pretty one of a kind and unique, under the direction of a guy named Jeremy Begbie, who some of you will have heard of, I imagine. But Christina is pretty unique as far as the people who have at least come through that program in the past, in that she's specifically focused on visual art. There's been lots of people, as this has become a bigger kind of discipline, that have gotten into theology and music and theology and poetry and all the rest. And there hasn't been a ton of people who have taken up theology and the visual arts specifically with an eye towards modern art. So just like imagine the last time that you were, in a museum, some kind of general museum, and when you're walking through like all the visual art, you notice that the pictures for the first 1,500 years of world history are pictures of Jesus and Mary. And then all of a sudden it stops, right? We get into the kind of modern era, and it stops being cool, and stops being really philosophically defensible, to continue to make representational art that is pictures of Jesus and Mary. And there's a couple, there's a complex reasons for that. One thing I always try to point out is that one big reason for that is the church stopped paying for it. And so I do think it's a lost vocation of the church's life to be itself a patron of the arts. But also there were some pretty fundamental kind of philosophical shifts and theological shifts that happened that made it just a lot more difficult to sell that kind of stuff. Anyway, so this is the kind of world that Christina lives in. So I asked her to come talk to us about, not really about Ruo specifically or about our show specifically, but really more generally about how to engage modern art as a Christian. Because I think the other experience that lots of us can have is that when we go to the museum and we go to the cool, pretty stuff of all the Impressionists and 19th century stuff, all this kind of visually really stunning stuff that we might feel our kind of souls cry out for, and then not really have the vocabulary to be able to connect this stuff to our Christian life or Christian vocabulary. So how do we engage with non-Christian art Christianly, I guess it would be a way to put it. So we're going to step next week. We have another friend who's coming who's written a big thesis on Rouault, and we're going to dive deep back into the Rouault stuff. But Christina is using a couple of the images tonight. But yeah, I just thought it would be helpful to have another kind of more general conversation. So delighted to have you, Christina. Thanks for being with us all the way on Eastern Standard Time. It's all yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. And I'm so glad to be with you all tonight. Like Zach said, we're both from Arkansas, but it's so strange that we didn't get to, and we're actually from like towns that are about 40 minutes apart from each other, but we didn't get to know each other until we both moved to North Carolina. So strange. But yeah, I've known Zach for almost a decade, and I feel a particular kinship for him and Anna because my husband is also a priest. So I understand the weirdness of priests. And yes, this is normal. Like the theology and the liturgical nerdiness, that's very normal. So yeah,
Do you want to say anything else about about your background or what you're studying or anything? I just didn't give you the
Sure.
opportunity.
Yeah. Yeah, like Zach said, I'm doing a doctorate in theology and the visual arts. I taught art history for a few years before I came here to do my doctorate. And my passion is really teaching God's people how to engage visual art, specifically modernism. So this is exactly what Zach was just mentioning. So I'm super glad to be here with you tonight, and maybe let's get going because I've got a lot of stuff for us to talk about. So the first thing that I want to just throw out there for you guys is a prompt, and that is, tell me about a time when you were truly moved by an artwork. Okay. So it could be a visual artwork, it could be a movie, a song, a novel, a dance. It could be anything. And I'm going to start so that I can give you guys a little bit of time to think through what you want to share, when you want to share. And this just happened just the other day. I'm going to pull it up on my phone. So Elizabeth Mowers has an Instagram account called Mama Writes Poetry, and she's a mother that writes poetry. And I saw this poem on an Instagram account of a mutual friend of Zach and I's, Alyssa Case, who runs another account for theology and children. So anyway, she posted this poem, and I was in the middle of some like fresh pandemic craziness with a sick toddler, and this poem just gutted me. It just got me right where I was at. I cried for a solid 20 minutes, probably. And my husband was just like, what is happening? I don't understand. But it's short, so I thought I'd read it to you really quick, just to kind of give you a sense of where I'm at. So mostly what I feel is so tired, ragged really, and so ready for this phase to be over. It's just that every so often, briefly, I feel that whooshing in my ears and the threads of time fraying at my fingers. And I think of the last day that you will ever say, Mama, I'm a kitten, and curl in my lap to fall asleep. And I cry a little for that future me. And I cry a little for right now me, holding the weight of such glory with such tired arms. That's the poem. I feel like crying right now. This is so moving to me. So yeah, nice to meet you. I'm Christina. I cry at Instagram poetry. Is what I need to tell you. So does anyone want to share about a moment when they were moved profoundly by an artwork?
I'll go.
Yeah, please.
We were in the diplomatic service assigned to Dakar in Senegal for 3 years. And there is a church in about 25 miles outside the capital where Catholic priests have essentially a monastery, and they have adapted as part of the service the use of the kora, which is a stringed instrument typical of Senegalese music. It has a kind of eerie harp-like, if you were to think of a harp with only say three or four strings. And they've integrated it into the Catholic Mass. And so what you have is the eerie sound of the African music with a mixture of Wolof, the local language, and French, maybe a little bit even of Latin, but singing the familiar parts of the Catholic Mass. And it's something where when you go and you sit in that quiet space and listen to it, you are touched by all those different influences all at once. The Christianity, the traditional Mass, the African music, the setting, the Catholic aspect of a very, very, very simple church. So I found it profoundly moving, and we listen to that music fairly often because they produced 3 or 4 compact discs, which we snapped up.
Oh, that's lovely. That's lovely. Thank you so much for sharing. I love that it was an integration of Christianity and the local culture as well. Does anyone else want to share? Like I said, it could be anything.
Well, I'll share. Many years ago, I was in Washington, D.C., and I do not know what museum we went to. I'm sure we went to many, and I can't remember the name of it, but I walked into one room and there was on the wall just a sculpture of 2 hands like this on top of a chest. And it was just that. And it was the most beautiful thing to me and just caught me. And I couldn't leave it for a long time. And it was so important.
Yeah. Isn't it interesting, those moments where we just feel like we're transported into another world and we are caught in that moment. We can't, like you said, we can't leave. That's the good stuff.
Yes.
Yeah. Anyone else? If you thought of one and you just don't want to share right now, we can even talk about this later on too. So keep thinking about those moments when an artwork has really moved you. So now that I know a little bit more about you and where you're coming from, I'm going to tell you a little bit about one approach that I think is helpful when Christians are looking at modernist visual art. So I'm going to be looking at I have 2 screens here, and one will be my PowerPoint presentation, and I have a manuscript too. So if I'm looking to the side, it's not because I'm not interested in you, it's because I'm looking at all of my stuff. You're very interesting, I promise. Yeah, okay, so I'm going to start on ground that we're all familiar with, the Bible. And I'm going to share the screen so that you can see. All right. All right. Can you see that?
Yeah. Yeah.
Good. Okay, great. So in Colossians 1, Paul says that Christ is the image of the invisible God. Now, this verse and others like it forms the basis for a practice that I bet at least some of you are familiar with, and that is iconography. Now, if you aren't familiar with iconography, it's a special type of Christian art. And the earliest icons were created in the first centuries of Christian history. But the practice really exploded as a liturgical phenomenon in Byzantium. Here's an example. I have an icon. We have this icon commissioned for our wedding, actually. And it's a Christ Pantocrator. Yeah, and I'll show you some more examples in a moment. So some Christian traditions, primarily Eastern Orthodox churches, they see icons as an essential part of their worship and practice. And these icons are understood as windows or thresholds to the divine. To look at an icon in these churches is to be shown something of the Lord. It's not you doing the activity, it's the Lord acting upon you. You're being shown something of the Lord. Now, in the 8th century, though, there was a huge conflict over whether or not it was fitting to use icons in Christian worship. And I bet that you can imagine what some of those reasons might have been. But the defenders of icons went back to this verse in Colossians, and another one like it like in John 15, 14, where Jesus says, anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. And they say that a portrait of Jesus is a portrait of God. The ordinary humanity of Jesus, in other words, can show us God. And the defenders of icons won the day. It's a practice that is still very, very present in Orthodox churches and in churches all over the world. So we could talk a lot more about icons and about the Christology that undergirds this. And maybe we will later on. But the main thing I want us to see about icons, and that's going to be our bridge to modernism, is this stylistic technique that they use, that the artists use for them. And I'm going to call this like a stripping down of the style. I think it's really easy to see it when you put it in contrast to the era of art that went right before it, the Greco-Roman world. Now, if you look at these artworks, these sculptures, the proportions are perfect. They are realistic in as much as like perfect bodies are realistic. But the Greco-Roman artists were just masters of this. But the Christian artists in Byzantium, they didn't choose to go with this photorealistic or perfectly proportioned style. Instead, they created this stripped down style of iconography. Now I'm going to open it up. Why do you think that they might have gone? It seems like they've gone backwards. Why do you think they might have gone backwards? Any ideas?
No.
Well, one reason that has been given through art history is that their goals are different. Their goal is a spiritual goal. They want to show a spiritual reality instead of an idealized earthly reality. So they're demonstrating a spiritual truth. A wonderful scholar named Natalie Carnes, no relation to myself. She works on images and theology. She calls this apophatic reserve. And in her words, apophatic reserve is a word of silence, a negation of itself as a visual form, which is built into an icon's pictorial rhetoric. Okay, so we have this stripping down. She calls it apophatic reserve. That's apophatic is a fancy word for saying stuff we don't know. or the things that we don't know. So apophatic reserve for her in an icon is saying the stripping down is showing us what we don't know. It's a way of reminding the viewer that we cannot comprehend all of God. As much as we try, we can't get our arms completely around the divine mystery of God. In fact, this is even true of all human persons too. We can know other people. We can know other people really well. But even as much as we know them well, we can't ever know perfectly well. And that is even more so true of the divine mystery that is our God. But this apophatic reserve isn't just telling us what we don't know. It's also reminding us of the abundance that there is to know in the divine mystery of our God. It opens up a reserve of mystery that has been shown to us in the person of Jesus Christ. So it opens up the possibility of remembering what we do know and to imagine and visualize what we don't yet know. So a way to say all of that in really simple terms, and I'm sure you've heard it before, is this stripping down, this apophatic reserve in icons makes the familiar strange and the strange familiar. Okay, so what is familiar about Jesus? His ordinary flesh, his humanity, his eyes, nose, ears, mouth, his hair. That's stuff that we are very familiar with. But the style, the stripping down, makes it a little strange. It's a little tweak to what we typically know to make us think, this is different. Why is he surrounded by gold? That's strange. It's strange for a person to be surrounded by gold like that. It makes us think, that's a little strange. But it also makes the strange God, who is very different than us, familiar. God, who is divine, who is light itself, who is eternal, is represented in this icon also as the man Jesus Christ. The strange is familiar. Okay, so we don't have a completely abstract image that's only light or only gold or only a symbol. We have a person that's familiar, and that's Jesus Christ. And obviously there is an incarnational principle that grounds all of that. So, okay, so let's move on to modernism, what we're actually here for, right? Now, modernism is so many things, and do not let anyone tell you different than that. Modernism is a million different styles, all wrapped up into one thing. But what I'm going to do is focus on one stylistic element that I think is usually present in a lot of modernism. And I bet you can guess what that element is. It's this stripping down, or this apophatic reserve that we've been talking about. Rouault's work that is present right now in your lovely church is an excellent example of this. Let's look at a few of those images together here. We see two images of Jesus, an image of a woman, and we see familiar things, eyes, ears, nose. But we also see it in a strange way. It's presented to us stripped down. It's presented to us in a way that's almost like a child's rendering. It's made strange to us. It's not quite how we would imagine a perfect rendering of Jesus or of a woman might look like. All right, let's look at some other images of modernism as well. And I know that your rector is a huge fan of Van Gogh, so I had to include some Van Gogh in here.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. But here we have Gauguin, Van Gogh, Cézanne, and Mondrian. In Gauguin's image, this is his self-portrait. Again, we see a lot of familiar things, but it's put in a strange way. Similarly to Van Gogh, Cézanne here at the top, it's a mountaintop, but we can see the brushstrokes really clearly. We can see just planes of color, even some expanses of canvas. And then Mondrian, I think Mondrian is maybe the most extreme example of this that we have here. He originally decided to paint a tree, and he took visually the pieces of the tree, pulled them apart until they were the most basic or essential visual units that he could imagine. And that's what he painted. So talk about stripping back or having an apophatic reserve. I would say there's nothing familiar, only strange in this image. Maybe the things that are familiar are just the colors and the shapes. So to understand apophatic reserve or stripping down, to understand what that is doing in modernism, we have to think about the artist's goals, just like we did with the icons. I think there are two ways that we can think about those goals that the artists have. One, they want to tell the truth, and they want to re-enchant the world. Let's look at some examples. Telling the truth. This is what I'm showing you here are two examples of realist artists. They cropped up at the end of the 19th century in response to what they saw was some pretty crazy stuff happening in the arts, the popular arts at the time, the arts that were seen as the best. This is a Rococo painting next to a Courbet painting. And you'll see in the Rococo painting, there's a lovely young woman flipping her shoe off as she swings through the forest. And if you look closely, you can see a young man there underneath who maybe wants to catch the shoe, maybe wants to catch a view of something else. But the rendering is beautiful. Her hair is soft. Her dress is, you could almost reach out and touch it. It looks like the satin is shiny and silky. The trees and the foliage are in full bloom. They are perfect. What is happening here? The artist is showing off. And the artist is showing off not just so that he can get the badge that he's the best artist ever, but so that he can make a buck too. And this is what art had really become. Art was something that the artist was showing off, and art was commercial. Now, Courbet came along and thought, surely there's more to art than this. Surely art maybe is about telling the truth. So instead of painting idealized aristocrats having fun in their perfect little gowns and their perfect gardens, he wanted to paint those who the aristocrats maybe tried not to see, the people that were working on the side of the road. So this image is called the Stone Breakers. And you'll see that the man looks a little too old to be doing that work. The young man looks a little too young to be doing the work. Their clothes are ripped and torn. This is the truth of French life as Courbet saw it. Not the swing, but the stone breaking on the side of the road. This is what he said was the truth. So not only was he telling the truth socioeconomically, he was also interested in telling the truth about painting itself. So this is where you start to see the breaking down of perfected technique too. If you look at it really closely next to this Rococo painting, you can see that the brush strokes are starting to show through. The canvas is starting to show through a little bit here. It's not as photorealistic. It's not perfected like the Rococo pieces. And that's part of Courbet saying, let me tell you the truth about painting. I'm using paint here on a canvas. This is not a window that you can look through. This is not a photograph. This is a painting. So that's one goal that the artists had in mind, that modernist artists have in mind. Another goal that modernist artists have in mind sometimes is a re-enchantment of the world. Okay, right here we have Matisse on the left-hand side, so his later cutout paperworks, and of course another beautiful Van Gogh by Starry Night. Yes. And I'm going to put the Starry Night in comparison to a classical, neoclassical painting by David about Socrates. This is Socrates depicted right before he drinks the poison and commits suicide. You can see in the David painting that everything is perfectly ordered and everything is perfectly shown to the viewer. This is a painting that was made post-Enlightenment. And if you know, the Enlightenment was a time when human reason was seen as the most important thing in the entire world. And what you couldn't see with your eyes and understand with your brain was not true and was not actually worth thinking about. And so a lot of artworks, they took on this idea that the best thing you could do is demonstrate human reason. And there was nothing beyond that. No spiritual world, no romantic world, no emotional world. Basic reason was the most important thing that was important to show in painting. Now, of course, this is quite a simplification of a very important movement. But basically, it was about human reason. Some art historians see the movement in modernism towards arbitrary color, bright color, and this restraint showing this apophatic reserve. They see that as a move to re-enchant the world, to bring that spiritual dimension, that emotional dimension, that romantic dimension back into painting that maybe had left before. And you can see that even just if you look at the lines of these two paintings. Look at Socrates on his bed. He's got a perfect angle here, angle for his leg. He's on the bed perfectly in the middle of the canvas. There is nothing about that that's disordered. But if you look over to the Van Gogh painting, this is more about a vision, a perception, a feeling that the Starry Night has given to the artist. And maybe Zach can say some more about that in a little bit, about how he sees that as re-enchanting the world. But I see all of these artworks in modernism as being similar to the icons in that they make the familiar strange and the strange familiar. Okay, so here we have, oh, maybe I should go back to this. In Courbet's, we see the overly familiar become strange to us again because they're put right here in front in an art gallery. What are these stone breakers on the side of the road doing in an art gallery? The familiar is made strange to us, and the strange is made familiar. Similar to Van Gogh. How many people have seen the stars in the nighttime sky? Everybody, but it's made strange to us again through this re-enchantment of the world. Okay, so at this point, we have a Christological way of thinking about one technique of imaging in modernist visual art. We know a little theology and a little art history, and we've drawn a nice parallel. And so we have a nice little theory, but what good does it really do for us? I think there are a lot of ways that this parallel can help us think about modernist art, but I want to focus in on one way in particular because of the season that we're in, because of Lent, and Holy Week is coming sooner than we think. This stripping down technique, this apophatic reserve, is used in modernism in a lot of ways. But I think it's particularly good for depicting the strangeness and familiarity of grief, of brokenness, lament. By thinking about modernist art in this way, the artwork might help us to better understand the plight of the suffering in a Christological way, which might lead us to empathy and hopefully to action and hopefully to penitence and hopefully eventually to praise. Of course, the gospel of Jesus Christ, who is, as we've learned, the image of the invisible God, is about God experiencing the fullness of these brokennesses, even unto death on a cross, and triumphing over them, healing us and the world in his victory. And we have a liturgical way of showing us that you guys might be familiar with. You might have experienced it. And it's called the stripping of the altar. In some churches, this is the ritual that's enacted after the Maundy Thursday service. All of the liturgical utensils are taken away from the altar. The candlesticks, the frontal, even the outer vestments worn by the clergy are put away. And the cross and the icons, if they're present, are veiled. So the reason why all of the stripping happens is to show the nadir of Christ's life with us in the world. The image of the invisible God, Jesus Christ, is silenced. The image has made the strange familiar to us, but he is no longer here to image for us because he has died and been put away in the tomb. So we have a visual silence in the worship space in the same way that there is a silence because Christ is in the tomb. The image was blotted out from God's world in this moment. And so we have, so we blot out all of the liturgical fancy stuff. Of course, on this side of the resurrection, Christ's people, the church, enact this solemn service with one eye on the empty cross, knowing that Christ is not there because not only has he died and been put in the grave, but because he has ascended to the right hand of the Father in heaven. So, but how do I approach modernist visual artworks with this kind of mindset, with this understanding of grief and empathy? I have a few basic questions for us to ask. The first question is one that I learned when I was working in the galleries with kindergartners, actually. And I'm not trying to say that you guys are like kindergartners, but I am saying that you can learn a lot from kindergartners. And that is just what is going on here. When you first encounter an artwork, a modernist artwork, ask yourself the question, what is going on here? The next question, what persons, objects, emotions are familiar to me in this artwork? And how do I know them? Is it familiar because I see eyes and ears and a mouth? So that's a person. And then what is strange about the persons, objects, or emotions that are present in the artwork? What do I not know? And then, of course, this last one, what does this leave me wanting? Does this leave me wanting God to resolve this pain in some way? Does it leave me wanting to know more about the plight of these people on the side of the road? Does this leave me wanting, what does it leave you wanting? Okay, let's look at one example, and then I want to talk to you guys a little bit more about the exhibition, and I want to hear some questions, and we'll have a little conversation. So this is Picasso. Actually, I want to look at Guernica. This is Picasso's Guernica. Picasso is one of the most famous modernist artists. He painted this after the bombing of the town called Guernica in the Second World War. And it was a town primarily comprised of civilians. It was just decimated. And Picasso was originally Spanish. Guernica is a Spanish town. Picasso started painting this 6 days after the bombing occurred, and it is a mural. It's enormous. So what's familiar here? What's familiar is obviously the persons and the animals, the eyes. But what also is very familiar is this expression here. This is a mother holding a dead child. What's familiar to me here is the enormity of that, what that tragedy would be like. But what's strange to me about this, is the lack of color. What's strange to me about this is the way that it is drawn like a child drew it almost. What's strange to me about this is the cubist kind of forms, the way that things are sharp. And what does this leave me wanting? This leaves me wanting hope for this mother. This leaves me wanting a stable for that horse. This leaves me wanting knowledge of what that eyeball light bulb thing is up at the top. This leaves me wanting no more bombs in the world. This leaves me wanting no more war or assault in a really visceral, in a really fundamental way that almost a child could understand. And that makes the childlike way of rendering makes me think about it in that way. Okay, so I've just modeled that for you guys. Now I'm going to put this up. This is one of y'all's artworks that you have up in your church right now. You've learned a lot about Rouault in this in the last few weeks. You've learned about this exhibition. I want to hear from y'all. What is going on in this image? What's familiar? What's strange? What does it leave you? What do you want from it? And I'm going to open up the floor to all of you, including you, Zach.
Let's see. Some of you may have to unmute yourselves. I think I had the settings the opposite way, but be brave. Kindergartners. Nobody knows what's going on here. We're Christians. There's a big example of it right there.
Anything familiar about this?
Yes.
Yeah. Don't be afraid to say really basic things. That is what gets things going.
Christ is on the cross.
Yes.
Christ has died.
That's right. Christ is on the cross. Christ has died. What else? Is there an emotion or an object here that's familiar? How do you know this is Christ?
The halo.
Yeah, there's a halo. There's rays of sunshine coming out of his head. Why does that tell us that that's Christ?
We just know it.
We just know it. Yeah, because Christ has a halo.
Yeah.
Holy people have
Yeah.
halos in art. That's right. Now, what's strange about this, though? How is this different than other depictions of the cross that maybe you've seen before?
We only see a part of him. A lot is missing.
A lot is missing. That's right. We see him only his torso. We don't. What do we not see?
His pierced hands.
Yes. Now we know, because we know we're super familiar with the story, that the way that Christ was put upon the cross was the piercings in the nails in his hands and in his feet. And so that's one thing that we're looking for here that we do not see. Do you wonder why maybe Rouault didn't include that, or why he chose to focus in?
Mhm.
Do you have any ideas? Does anyone have any ideas?
It's not, I don't have any ideas, but I also noticed the cross is wider in the center than it is. Usually, the beams are proportional to one another. And it's also, the whole cross is slightly off center in a way.
Very good. Very good.
OCD,
Yeah. Yeah. Also, if you're following those lines, there's also a horizon line at the bottom that's parallel with the line in the center of the cross.
Mhm.
Why might the cross be off center? What do you do when you put something in the center of an image? You usually want to put focus on that, right? This is the hero. This is the star. This is the most important thing. What does it mean to decenter something, or to put something a little askew?
It makes me uncomfortable, or it makes me feel askew.
Right. I mean, you just said it hurts my OCD. It makes us feel uncomfortable. Ugh, I want to tilt it. I want to just fix it a little bit.
Mhm.
And maybe that is the emotion that he wants to conjure in us. That's something that he wants us to feel when we look at the cross of Jesus Christ. Maybe we should be a little uneasy, queasy about it. What else? Do you see anything else that is familiar or maybe is strange in this image?
I think the neck and the position of the head just looks really odd and off. It's like the torso looks realistic, the face looks kind of realistic, and then there's just this very odd neck connecting the two.
Yeah. It's a thick neck, and his head almost looks like it's been kind of copy and pasted onto that neck, doesn't it? But
Yes.
again, what I get when I look at this, I don't know, tell me what y'all think. When I look at that, I feel really uncomfortable. Like, that is hard for me to imagine having my head in that position.
I agree.
Yeah. I just noticed there's also no crown of thorns here. We're used to seeing a crown of thorns on Jesus.
It feels like there's a lot that's kind of competing against one another. I mean, like, it being off center and the position of his neck are things that make me uncomfortable. But then there's also a kind of it's also more of a peaceful crucifixion than you're used to seeing. I think the halo is not necessarily what you'd expect. You'd expect a crown of thorns, even though his head is kind of, the neck is in an uncomfortable position. The expression on his face is actually quite serene,
Yeah.
So that
It's
it's
not
I don't know,
bloody.
it seems to be, there's kind of mixed messages almost happening,
Mm-hmm.
or complex messages.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that it's easy. It's when I think of a crucifixion that makes me uncomfortable, the first thing that comes to my mind is like the movie The Passion of the Christ or something, you know, where it's just a bloody, violent mess. And it's really effective in that way. It's violent. And sometimes we need that. But this crucifixion painting makes me uncomfortable because Christ is uncomfortable, but he's also God in this image. I'm not shown his blood. I'm not shown that where the nails are piercing his hand, but I'm shown his holiness. I don't know. I'm just thinking aloud with you guys here. I like what you said, that it's more serene. It's more of a peaceful crucifixion. Does anyone else have further thoughts on that? Any last things you want to say about this before we open it up a little bit more?
Something you miss, I think, I'm sorry I keep talking, but
No,
something
go for
you
it.
miss see, I'm the only one here that's in the room with this thing, and it's right over here on my left. And one thing that I noticed looking at it on the wall is that one of the consequences of the decision to only show the very middle section of the crucifixion is that what it does is it makes Jesus's body almost the same size as yours looking at it. So you're looking at, you know, a Jesus on the cross whose body is about the same size as yours, whose face is kind of about the same size as yours. And so meaning that, you know, if you stretched your arms out looking at it directly, you know, you would know how the picture is finished in a quite uncomfortable way.
Oof.
Yeah. Yep.
I also, one last thing to notice is that torso, those ribs. You can really kind of feel that suffocation, or how he would be gasping for breath. Even you can kind of see the bones in his chest as well. Makes me kind of, and because there's no color in it either, it makes it kind of feel breathless, like a breathless image. Yeah. Well, thank you for doing that, y'all. Thank you for looking at that with me. And we can go back and we can talk about whatever else you want to talk about. My presentation is done, so let's talk. Should I stop my screen share?
Sure, that's fine.
Okay.
What questions do you have for Christina, or yeah, what questions, what curiosities do you have?
I've not seen the body of work that's in the church yet, but I intend to. Is it all about Christ and the crucifixion?
No, well, yes and no. It's a lot of, sorry, my computer. It's a lot of Jesus for sure, but there's also, you know, part of it's also a mixture of Rouault's kind of different shows or kind of collections. But the central collection, the Miserere collection, is itself a mix of pictures of Jesus and then pictures of clowns and prostitutes and the bourgeois, and it's meant to kind of be viewed as a journey. So I think I hope that those of you who haven't been able to make it up yet are able to, because I think the pieces begin to take on a different kind of tenor when they're in conversation with one another.
I was telling Zach before we started meeting here that this same show was hung at Duke Chapel, which is the big cathedral-like church that we have here on campus. And to see these pieces next to the stained glass windows was really striking, because sometimes these are called stained glass inspired pieces, or Cloisonnism. And it's because they have that thick, almost like lead black outline.
Yes.
And also, yeah, and also their faces are modernist. So it's like almost a cartoon-like face. And Zach, I don't know if you remember the stained glass at Duke Chapel, but some of those faces, it's not like a realistic rendering of the faces. So to see these two together was so interesting and really, really fascinating.
Yeah.
You have this really traditional stained glass window next to this very, very modern thing, and they look so much alike.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
yeah, go ahead, Andrew.
Christina, I know that we will all view this in our own way and get what we can from it, but is there any way that as we look at this exhibit that we should be thinking or looking at it beyond what those 5 questions were that you asked, which I thought were excellent?
Oh, thank you. Well, yeah, those questions were intended to be applicable to a lot of modernist visual art, specifically artworks that talk about suffering or talk about despair and that kind of thing.
Yes.
But I would ask even more specific questions about how is this suffering that I'm looking at like the suffering in my life? How have I experienced this? Or how has someone close to me experienced that emotion that I'm seeing depicted here? And in that way, you can connect a piece of your own story with a piece of the story that's being told in these paintings.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. I mean, I think that, I mean, another way to, or maybe another word we could use instead of apophatic reserve, which I find to be an extremely helpful phrase. But it's what that one thing that I would be tempted to name that space is prayer. And just in the sense that, like, what's happening is that an image, and that icons in particular are meant to do this, but they are trying to create a space. You know, Christina said at the beginning, in icons, it's God doing the work, coming through the icon towards you. And so what's happening is it's trying to create a space between you and the artwork in which a conversation can start to happen. And I don't know about you, but I often go through seasons in my life where praying is difficult and feeling like God is not there, not listening, not real, you know, whatever. And I find visual art to be a very helpful instrument because it's at least something that talks back a little bit. And I think those questions, even with kind of modernist art that is not itself always explicitly religious or anything, to start by saying, what's going on here? What is familiar to me? What is strange? And what is being asked of me? What that's inviting you into is a conversation that can be transposed into something that's like something that's similar enough to prayer as I've experienced it, that I feel comfortable calling it prayer.
Yes.
And so I think, you know, I mean, that's part of why, you know, I mean, I want us to have an eye towards that's why we've shaped these talks the way we have, the kind of formational import of visual art for our own lives of discipleship. And so if you are currently in a season of feeling like prayer is frustrating and impossible, like, just this is kind of maybe a gift of how stupid it is. We have to follow all these, not stupid, but that COVID is real and you can only come and see this one at a time. What that means is that you can schedule a full hour for yourself to come and be alone in church with no agenda, but to talk to the wall and God. Like, that sounds pretty cool to me.
That's awesome. I wish I was in Texas.
Well, everybody comes to Texas eventually, in my experience. So it's swallowed up one friend after another. So I'm sure it's just a matter of time for you guys. Well, I'll wrap us up there, I guess. Any closing thoughts, Christina? You left us with plenty to ponder.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you so much. And I love what you said about prayer. I think that another way to think about that prayer is the kind of work that you do when you go out of the church too.
Mm.
It leads us to worship,
Mhm,
leads us to worship, and it also leads us to action.
mhm.
If we empathize with the suffering of our Lord, we should also empathize with the suffering of those around us.
Exactly.
So,
Thank you.
so I would encourage you both to think about, how is this like my story, and how is this like the stories of my neighbors as well?
Mhm.
This show is particularly good for that.
Good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, it's the very end of Zoom meetings, especially when the main part of it was a presentation, is always kind of a bummer, because in real life we get to clap and say thank you and then talk to you on the way out, but then half the people are muted, and so even if we clap, you can't hear them and you don't feel the affirmation that you deserve. So just hear us when we say thank you. It's been
Thank
such a
you.
gift to have you, Christina. We're
I'll
lucky
clap for
that-
you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank y'all for
Uh,
coming and being a part
yeah.
of this.
Thanks for being here. We're so grateful that
Thank
you're
you.
doing the work that
Yep.
you're doing.
Thank
So we get to hear things like
Absolutely.
this.
Absolutely.
All right, y'all. Well, we will be back together next week. We have another friend, and we're going to dive back into this show in particular. And I'm really excited about that conversation. So thanks for being here, and we'll see you all next week. For those of you I don't see on
Thank you.
Sunday. All
Thanks,
right.
Zach.
Peace.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Peace. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.